Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Demystifying Systemic SEL webinar series. Before we begin, because every single person on this webinar is involved with the care of children in some way, whether you are a teacher, other school personnel, a parent, a community member, a caregiver. This week, we were all on the emotional roller coaster, which plummeted us to a point of agony and despair as we watched the senseless murder of young people and teachers in Texas. Our hearts go out to all of the students, staff, families, and community members who are trying to make sense of the senseless. At this time, more than ever, we need to reach out to each other with empathy, care, and love to be reminded of good over evil, and also to be reminded of the necessity of care and compassion at all times. So again, thank you for joining us for this Demystifying Systemic SEL series. We hope you have been able to participate in some of the other sessions that have occurred. Most recently, the session that was on student voice a couple of weeks ago. There will be more, so stay tuned. Today, we're going to be digging into supportive school and classroom climates. I remember when I was appointed a high school principal in a very challenging school in my hometown, my marching orders were to immediately focus on culture and climate, not academics, but culture and climate. I did, and boy, did it make a difference. So I clearly understand why. Take a minute and just think about your school experience and talk about in the chat a time when you felt extremely safe, cared for, and protected in your school. You felt that you were ready to engage, or what would you have needed for that to happen? Just take a minute and think about it and put your responses in the chat, please. I see someone just wrote, I needed someone to see me, the importance of being seen. Strong relationships, people willing to listen, willing to care, feeling like I belonged, someone to engage my curiosity. So thank you so much for going back down memory lane, for reflecting on what it was like for you. I'm sure some of these same conditions that were important for you are conditions that you are working for and looking for in the schools with which you engage. So let's frame this whole notion of supportive climate for a minute. When we talk about supportive school and classroom climates, we know that SEL implementation cannot occur well until there is a supportive school and classroom climate where all students feel valued, cared for, engaged, supported, some of those same characteristics that you surfaced as you thought about your own childhood experience. And we know there are so many things that contribute to a supportive classroom and school culture. Relationships, the importance of knowing that you belong, feeling relational trust with students, with staff, with everyone who engages with the school community. We know it's important that staff, excuse me, are well grounded in their own SEL, including their ability to be culturally competent and their willingness to model SEL. We know that students need to focus on their own social and emotional competence. We know that in order for there to be a supportive school climate, students need to have an opportunity for student voice, which was the topic of our last series. We know that discipline policies must be revisited through a lens of equity and fairness. And then we also know that family engagement is critical if we are going to have a supportive school and classroom climate. It's also important for students to be able to develop their social and emotional skills at all stages of their school experience because they feel more academically engaged when they have a sense of belonging and safety. Educators can do things such as develop shared agreements with their students and engage in other community building strategies so the focus is always on improving the school culture and climate. At this time, we're going to watch a short video clip that really does show a manifestation of some of the things I've mentioned and some of the guidance we're going to receive from our panelists in a few minutes. As you're watching, feel free to drop things in the chat in case you want to come back to your thoughts later. So with that, here's the video clip.
We want school to be a safe, welcoming place where kids want to come here every day. They could be coming in the morning with lots of different emotions.
We're so glad that you're here this morning.
That we want to help mitigate so that they feel safe and secure at school.
Good morning, Jolene. We're glad you're here. Let me tell you what's happening this morning. We have pancakes for breakfast and pears.
It's very important that school be a reliable, consistent, routine place where you know what to count on, where things are somewhat predictable. Not so much that they become boring, but so much that they give you that calm feeling that I know what it's about, I know how to participate, and that actually opens up the opportunity for more learning.
Thank you. Wow, pancakes and pears, that would certainly help me get my day started in a very positive way. You can watch the rest of that video at your leisure. We will have the link to the full clip later, but that was just to whet your appetite for what we know is coming. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our two panelists who will be sharing their words of wisdom and their guidance on this topic. So I'm going to ask them each to come on screen and I'll read a little bit about them. So the first is Dr. Camille Farrington. Camille. Looks like she might be calling in. So let me go to Michelle. Oh, there's Camille. Okay, welcome, Camille. Dr. Camille Farrington is a managing director and senior research associate at the University of Chicago Consortium. She is a national expert on academic mindsets and the measurement of psychosocial factors in academic settings. Her research focuses on understanding how learning environments provide opportunities for positive development experience for students. So welcome, Camille. We're excited to have you here with us. Our second panelist, thank you. Our second panelist is Michelle Jackson. Michelle is the high school SEL support manager and the Office of Social and Emotional Learning in Chicago Public Schools. For 17 years, she has worked in and alongside schools to help cultivate safe and supportive learning experiences tailored to the needs and cultural identities of students. So Michelle, welcome. Really excited to have you both here with us. So let's begin by just painting the scene. When we think about a safe and supportive school climate, what does it look like? What does it feel like to be in a classroom and a school with such a climate? If you had to describe the ideal climate in classrooms and schools, what would your description include? And let's begin at the classroom level by asking Camille for her thoughts on that question.
Thanks very much, Deidre. I'm really happy to be with you this morning. So I think in the chat, we saw exactly what that picture looks like. It's a place where young people feel seen, feel cared for, feel known. They're eager to be there. It's a place where they feel like good things are happening and they're, kind of good anticipation to walk in the door. You feel welcomed, feel like your ideas may be challenged, but your personhood is not going to be challenged. Your dignity is not going to be challenged. You're going to be able to, you don't have to pretend to be somebody you aren't, and you also don't have to hide parts of who you are. And so being able to bring your full self without being worried, distracted, guarded, but it's a safe space to be. And I think it's also really important, just the physical environment, that it's a place that's beautiful and inviting and feels like love and care was put into it, and that it conveys to you that you're important and that surrounded by beauty and interesting things. I think all of that really creates an environment that makes people want to be there and able to learn and engage at their highest levels.
Thank you. That is so powerful. Not having to hide who you are, being able to show up as your authentic self. That really struck me. Thank you. And Michelle, let's talk about it a little more from the classroom level to the school level. What do you look for as indicators in the whole school?
I'm glad Camille mentioned what a school looks like. I often think of what a school feels like when I walk in the doors, and looking for a place that inspires curiosity from both adults and students. The power in creating, I know we overuse this phrase, but windows and not walls, or mirrors and not walls as well. So when I walk into a school, especially in Chicago, where we have a diverse number of schools and culture from community to community can be so very strong and inspiring, I'm looking to see that cultural representation mirrored across the school, from the students to the families to the epistemology of the communities being embedded within the schools. I'm also looking for adults who are able to view and share their own cultures, and still provide the support that students need to feel, again, as was mentioned in the chat and by Dr. Farrington, identity, belonging, that safety that we know is so important for students to be able to thrive and learn.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going back for a minute I keep going back to my high school principal days. We had small learning communities, like schools within schools. And I once asked a senior, what's the difference between your section of the school and the rest of the school? And I'll never forget his response. His response was, out there are my people, but in here is my family. And it was just the way that he said it. So you knew the relationships were really solid and that he had a special affinity for the people that he engaged with on a daily basis. Thank you. So let's talk about the connection, between between culture and climate and social and emotional learning and social and emotional development. So what does one have to do with the other? Can you have one without the other? And again, I'm going to begin with Camille.
Yeah, so again, if we think about the physical environment, well, so I'll start just by saying that young people are making sense of what's happening to them all the time. And it's the sense that they make of their environment that determines their engagement, their behavior, and therefore their learning and development. And so that's the most important big idea in thinking about the relationship between climate and development. And so how people are experiencing, how young people are experiencing their environment is what determines their learning and development. And so again, if the physical environment is a welcoming place, a place that conveys that I'm valued and that I'm important and that I'm worth investing in, there are resources available to me, I know. And then do I know my way around that space, or do I know where to get the things that I need? So the kind of physical environment, and then the relationships within that environment. Again, am I known? Am I seen? All of those kinds of things. But classrooms, and I'm thinking mostly like at both the school or the classroom level. Part of what makes the climate is what are the opportunities available within that climate. And so do I have opportunities to explore new things, to meet and connect with and try to relate with young people that are like me or not like me? Do I have a space to exercise agency and leadership? And do I have opportunities to make choices? Because, leaders don't become leaders in the absence of opportunities to, practice leadership. And we don't develop agency in the absence of opportunities to make choices. So the developmental experiences that are available in a setting help me as a learner to explore who I am in relationship to other people, but also to engage in and exercise some of my competencies. If we think of, young people have the potential for a full range of academic and social and emotional competencies. And so what is it in that climate that's inviting and bringing out those competencies and having opportunities to exercise them? And so I think there's a very, very deep relationship. In fact, you can't separate out competency development from the environment in which young people are in.
Thank you. And that was a nice connection to the last webinar about the role of student voice in helping to determine what their safe and supportive environment will look like and be like from their perspective. So thank you. So Michelle, what do you see as the connection between social and emotional development and a supportive school climate?
I mean, it's everything. One can happen without the other, but not well. When it's done very well, you have that deep sense of SEL development embedded into the climate work of the school. We in CPS believe that it belongs at all levels and have looked at different ways to make sure that we are putting not just social and emotional learning, but wellness truly. We've taken a step back and are really looking at different ways to quantify or identify engagement and what does that look like. And so I think for a long time we thought of engagement solely from the academic perspective or from attendance, and now we're taking again a step back and thinking about wellness and connectedness as part of what climate work truly is and what lives at the heart of social and emotional learning when you look at the competencies. So we know that, for all of our schools to be successful, regardless of the community, regardless of the background of the students, we believe that SEL has to be thoroughly embedded into all of the work that we do. And so it's caused us to rethink how we structure our supports. We just came out actually about 2 months ago with a suicide prevention and mental health policy for our district that mandates behavioral health teams for schools. But we knew that in order for behavioral health teams to be successful, which is a tier 2, tier 3 intervention, we have to make sure that universal SEL and culture and climate are incredibly strong. And so that was also built into that policy to make sure that we are not pushing students into tiering that's unnecessary. We want to make sure that we really do have holistically, a strong understanding of what culture and climate looks like throughout CPS. And again, making it accessible for every student, every family, every community to be aware and participate in the practice of engaging in true SEL, whether it's adult SEL or student level SEL.
Yeah, Michelle, thank you for talking about the role of systems and making sure that, you know, the policies and practices, whether it's tiered supports or the professional learning that helps to make sure that all adults understand social emotional learning, their own development, because it's so important to think about it, not only at the classroom, the school level, but then what's in place systemically to make sure that all the wheels keep turning as they should. So thank you. So let's go to the area of data, excuse me. And Camille, since this is your specialty, would you launch us? What does the data say about the impact on climate, on a student's academic learning, on the student's overall development, their attendance, their engagement? What is data saying?
Yeah, so there is a lot of evidence of the connection between school and classroom climate and academic learning and social emotional development, and then positive educational and life outcomes. Just to point to a few things, a study in New York City of middle school students over time, and this is an interesting study. So it includes over 300,000 students, 278 schools, I think, and they followed over time. And what they found is that first, like the schools that had better school climates and the classrooms that had better classroom climates were associated with better academic gains for students, controlling even for their prior test scores and demographics and all of that. And they also found that schools that improved their climate over those 5 years was associated with improvements in the gains that students were making in those schools over time. So paying attention and investing in school climate pays off in terms of academics. We also see a study around classrooms that are growth oriented, the idea that the teacher really believes that everybody can accomplish, succeed at high levels, and sets up the environment to really support students' growth, that those classrooms are associated, and that this was 9th grade math classrooms across the country, that again, the growth oriented classrooms, higher math gains. And then a kind of meta-analysis across looking at studies from K-12, 61 studies, a total of 73,000 students in there. And there they saw better classroom climates associated not only with better academic achievement, but higher social competence and motivation and engagement, and then lower internalizing and externalizing behaviors. And that was especially true in classroom. They were looking at climate on kind of 3 levels. They were looking like instructional support, social emotional support, and then classroom management and behaviors. And that social emotional support climates that were strong in that were particularly connected to the social emotional development and competence of young people. And then the last piece I want to name is just a study that my team has done at the consortium, where we were looking at the same student in 2 different classrooms. Because oftentimes we think, well, students are either motivated or not motivated. They're engaged or they're not engaged. And so here we were really looking at measures of a classroom, and then that student's own mindsets, behaviors, and performance in that classroom, and then comparing them to themselves in a different classroom. And across the board, middle school, high school, around the country, all different areas of the country, all different races and cultures of students, that classrooms that had more supportive learning conditions were associated with that student reporting better mindsets in that class than they did in that same student reported in a less supportive environment, and then that student earned higher grades in those classrooms. So I think that the evidence is very, very strong that climate matters for learning and development. Kind of, we know that is for sure.
Right. And the chat is blowing up with requests for links to the studies. We will make sure that you have, we always send out resources. So we will make sure that you have access to some of the studies when you get the recording and the resources. So thank you, because the chat is on fire. So Michelle, would you talk a little bit about how Chicago Public Schools use data and continuous improvement in looking at the impact of culture and climate on student outcomes?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I was going to mention a study actually that U Chicago is coming out with about protective factors, but I don't want you guys to be mad at me because I can't give you any of the data yet. It's something that's on the horizon, but it speaks specifically to how data could be used and what some of our schools have done to really kind of mitigate the impact of COVID and crime that we know is persistent. It actually also speaks to, Deidre, what you mentioned earlier about that student, that senior who saw school as a place where you have family. So we're looking at a number of different ways to both introduce and fortify the way that we're using data right now. We typically go through a series of continuous improvement strategies on a biannual basis where we're looking at different ways to identify movement for continuous improvement for all of our schools. And so school leaders will come up with a continuous improvement plan. And within that plan, we have SEL embedded into the work. And so schools are not just holding themselves accountable, but actually using the strategies of our department of the Office of Social and Emotional Learning, as well as our sister and partner departments, to make sure that we are looking at evidence-based strategies for creating more cadence for social emotional learning, more progress monitoring, and then taking the next step into looking at how to use inventories, skills-based inventories around SEL, including the SECA and other new tools that we're beginning to roll out, including PERTS, and Elevate, and Cultivate, just to be able to get a deeper sense of how students are identifying SEL in the classroom and what those gaps are, not in an evaluatory way, but just to make sure that students are getting what they need. And so it's something that we're looking into improving upon. We right now, district-wide, have rolled out a number of different ways to screen and to include that in our data collection. And we're actually moving to a new data collection tool next school year. So I'm hopefully excited about that. That's going to measure a bit more of what we're doing with MTSS, including SEL, and I'm interested in seeing what that data is able to provide for us moving forward. So we're in this pocket, this weird place in time where it's ripe for the picking. We're coming, out of this 2, almost 3-year world change. And we know that this work is so incredibly important. It was important before, but it's very much important now, and our work has been elevated in our district in a way that it hasn't before. And so the pressure is really on to be able to meet the needs of students. And so we're just trying to rise to the occasion in providing as much feedback to schools, as much pertinent data, whether it's the 5 essentials, which Dr. Farrington is very familiar with, which identifies kind of how teachers and students and families feel about the environment of a school, the culture and climate of a school, and the work of teachers. But we're using and trying to figure out ways to filter all of this different data coming in into something that's actually productive for schools to be able to use for improvement. It's a long ramble, but we have a lot going on.
Thank you. A long ramble, but an appreciated ramble, according to the chat, where, by the way, someone from the consortium is putting links. So if you're like me, you'll want to save the chat and have access to those links. And I'm always one who's been a strong advocate of teacher research and practitioner inquiry and research. And how do we make sure that we're also capturing the qualitative research from teachers, the stories about how the focus on social and emotional development is resulting in improved culture and climate. So I just want to say those are important stories that hopefully are being captured as well, because they really resonate with a lot of people. So let's talk a little bit about the adults. So what is the role of adult interactions in developing climate? I mean, think about a school setting with all the dispositions and temperaments. How do we make sure that the adults are aware of how their interactions impact the climate? And Michelle, because you're talking from a school-based lens, I'm going to ask you to go first on that question.
The role of adults is everything. And we really, as a district, we started the work of working with students to make sure that SEL was embedded in every classroom. We did a lot of boxed kits initially and strategized on ways to work with high school students to make it impactful. And we realized that we made a big mistake. We have to work on the adults and get the adults prepared to be able to not just model, coach, and teach SEL, but really do a lot of examination of self, self-cultivation in order to be able to work with students and create culture and climate that resonated with all of our students and our families. And so the role of the adult in the creation of strong culture and climate, of strong SEL, is really to be able to, again, identify self. A lot of our coaching at this point is around for teachers and the learning that we're doing, both with I'm actually in our teaching and learning office today because I'm going to leave this conversation and work with one of my partner departments to embed more SEL into the curricula that is being taught across the district. And so we've done a great deal of work this year to make sure that SEL lives in all of our core content. But the role of the adult is always to make sure that they are actually able to present not just their best selves, but to be able to elevate the work of SEL throughout the classroom in ways that are both culturally relevant and sustaining, and that create more and more ways for students to not just be able to have a voice in the classroom, but to really have almost a power exchange where students are empowered to be representatives of their own learning, and to be able to model what that looks like for all of our students. And so it's a huge lift, but we're beginning to look at this work in an entirely different way than we ever have before.
Thank you. And I keep going back to, so even what's the role of the school leader? Putting on my principal hat again, how do you transform typical school artifacts like a faculty meeting? So it's not about, I used to always say, not about moan and groan, but about grow and glow. How do you acknowledge the humanity and give the adults space to really shine and to appreciate each other and to constantly feel good about being part of the school community? Thank you. So Camille, what would you say when it comes to the responsibility of adults and the disposition of adults to make sure that they're contributing to a positive school culture and climate?
Well, I love everything Michelle just said, and think that she really pointed to the critical pieces, like how adults show up for each other, for their work collectively as the adult community, because that sets the conditions for what's possible in that school space. And then how adults show up for young people in classrooms. So it really is so much about just the power of the person and what they're bringing to their interactions with both adults and young folks. And so that's the self-awareness, the really kind of intentionally directing your behavior and emotions and focus towards the things that are going to be most beneficial to your colleagues and to your students. And then adults in classrooms have really specific roles. Obviously, your role is to teach academic content, but I really like that we, as a field, have been expanding that conception. Not just my role is to teach academic content, but my role is to develop young people. And that includes their intellectual and academic cognitive development, but that can't be separated out from their social and emotional development, their identity development, their sense of who they are in the world. Like, those things are interconnected inside young people. And so we can't parse them apart in terms of their classroom experience. So setting up the conditions, the relationships, the interactions within a classroom, and creating the conditions that really support learning. I see my friend Jen from Mineola, New York, is in the chat here, and I love the way she describes this to her teachers, is setting the conditions so students can benefit from your high quality instruction. So, and I think that really says it all. So providing setting those conditions and then providing developmental opportunities for young people, like, that is the job of good teachers. And the third, so it's kind of setting the conditions, providing developmental opportunities, and then the third really important piece is just the modeling piece, because young people are watching you always, and how you manage your own emotions when you're interacting with them, how you problem solve, how you include other people or not, how you respond to challenges to your authority. Like, all those things speak volumes to how young people make sense of the environment they're in and the messages that are communicated to them about their value, their autonomy, their dignity, and their potential, and what the world is like. All of that gets communicated through how teachers behave in a classroom.
Right. Thank you. You are so correct. Students are always watching the adults and the adult behavior. So at this point, I'm going to open the Q&A and begin to pull some questions that our audience members have put into the Q&A. So the first one is, sometimes when we talk about school and classroom culture, we talk about outcomes, how it's seen, how it sounds, how it feels. But what are some small first steps for schools which have a more punitive, disrespectful culture that has been in place for years? So what would be some small first steps to overcome a punitive and disrespectful culture? So either one who wants to go first.
Michelle, you want to take that one?
I can take a crack at it.
Thank you.
I think I always go to talking with the students first. And so I think for a highly punitive system, and I watched a charter system in our city try and change their student code of conduct over the last summer, and I watched where it fell apart. It has to come from students. And so the guidance, the not just the voice, but the tone, the recommendations. Again, I spoke earlier a bit about community epistemology, like the families, the communities, they have to have a stake in identifying what works and what doesn't work for when we're talking about discipline. if you don't have that buy-in, if you don't have that feedback from someone who's experienced it, from someone who looks at it from a different lens, it ultimately may fail. I think the other thing that you have to consider is what are you giving up? What are you getting? And making sure that adults feel highly trained and capable, that they have the supports in place to be able to use other measures. If we're moving towards a more restorative framework, then what are the supports that are existing in that framework to be able to give adults what they need if you're moving from something that has been happening for a very long time in a way that people may not have felt safe about, but they felt comfortable and complacent doing. And so just making sure that, again, you have the right people at the table to be able to identify the flaws, the missteps, and to be able to create decision rules that are more aligned with shared work and shared understanding, again, shared agreements, is the best way to go. And so we, in Chicago, we work with a group of students every year to modify our student code of conduct and to give us feedback. And then they go out and train other students on what that actually looks like. And so we've changed the title of that document to the Student Rights and Responsibilities document in order for them to have ownership in it and to be able to amplify that throughout our district.
Thank you, Michelle. There's lots of great ideas being entered in the chat as well in terms of first steps, everything from having students help in the development of the language, having them sign contracts, playing games. I remember really enlisting the support of the football and basketball team because the students respected them so how could I use them as advocates for this work? So thank you. Shall we go to another question? There's a question about school boards. So there's a question about school boards are mainly interested in having students gain skills and looking at test scores as the way to see progress. So how is information about the importance of culture and climate being shared with school boards so that they get it, so that they'll prioritize it and they'll support efforts around culture and climate? Have either of you had experience in convincing school boards, swaying school boards, anything like that?
I don't have direct experience in this, but what I would say is that parents and caregivers, families, business people in communities, the stakeholders in schools fully understand that what they want is not just a high test scores from their young people, that they want them to be well, they want them to be healthy and thriving, and they want them to develop the skills to be able to be good family partners and community partners and workers and all the things. And so I think that in fact school boards hear that from families and communities, and over time I am seeing some shift in what's value. When the only metric is a test score, then that's what we use. But as we start shifting to paying more attention to climates and cultures and the conditions for learning, I don't think it's a hard sell actually for school boards. I'll put in a plug for an organization, School Board Partners, which partners with school boards to build the capacity of school board members, because it's as we can see around the country, an incredibly important and powerful role that in every local community. And so organizations that help build the capacity of citizens to serve on school boards, I think is a really critical piece in all this.
Yeah. I also am reminded about the number of our castle districts that have really started to engage their school boards in the work of SEL in general by incorporating, for instance, our 3 signature practices. So they'll begin the school board meeting with a warm welcome, and they'll end with an optimistic closure. Or one district I'm thinking of where I've done some work is they had their school board members handle their emotions by using the strategies from one of our evidence-based programs. So they all learned how to turtle, right? So the more you speak the language and get them to explore the practices, I think the more they'll be inclined to say, yes, this is good. And yes, this is what needs to be done in schools to contribute to a supportive culture and climate. So thank you. We have a question about the role of families. Let me see if I can pull it up again. Here it is. So how do you work with the families to understand their own children's developmental needs? Do you ever collaborate with the medical profession to evaluate the understanding of those needs? So how do we help? How do we make sure that families understand their role in understanding their young people to support a supportive school climate?
It's a tough question. And I think we're in the process, always like ever evolving in that process of family and community engagement. We are the 3rd largest district in the country. We have a large, diverse population of families that support our schools. And so we look to families to be able to share what we know are their, truths, and we have a lot of value for the importance of identifying and bringing in and creating safe spaces for parents to share their community beliefs and their understanding of SEL. But it's still something that we're tweaking because it looks so many different ways across all of our different departments, what the outreach looks like, what the feedback is. And so it's something that we're trying to codify in a way that we can share with others, but we're still in that process of trying to figure that out. Right now, it's been a lot of, unfortunately, parent trainings, but not a significant amount in the way that I would like to see of family feedback, where we're getting that information back in about specifically what the needs of students are and what the needs of communities are for this work. And that's where I know that we've dropped the ball. Mm-hmm. Or still, I don't, maybe drop the ball is a little strong. We just haven't identified maybe the best way to get, the really rich feedback that we know that our families have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So there's a question, probably our final question is about, goes back to data collection. The fact that data collection so often falls on teachers. How do we use these data collection tools so that teachers and school leaders are not continually overburdened with collecting data? Have either of you found a way to minimize the burdensome impact of just collecting data, and the fact that it very often not only falls on teachers, but very often it falls on teachers of particular subject areas or particular grades? So how do you remove the animosity around data collection?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. And I think that it depends. First of all, no one should ever collect data of any kind unless you have a plan for using that data and have the capacity to respond to that data. And so that's a baseline thing. And then the question of like, what is data used for, and by whom and for what purposes? And so I think that it's really important. I'm a big advocate of, we talk about shifting from downstream metrics and downstream measures. In other words, after the process is over and we get, academic results, so test scores and those kind of downstream metrics, and to shift upstream. So if we know that those downstream things are that students' academic outcomes or long-term outcomes are a result of their engagement in learning, right? And only the learner learns, as Zaretta Hammond says. And whether or not students engage in learning depends on something farther upstream, which is how they're interpreting the environment that they're in. And how they interpret the environment that they're in is even farther upstream. What are the conditions in which we're asking them to learn? And so trying to shift to get more of that kind of upstream measurement and data and feedback on those conditions and how young people are experiencing those conditions. And those are data that are immediately useful to teachers and should go directly to the hands of teachers. So it's very different if someone else is collecting data, or if I'm spending my class time collecting data that somebody else is going to use to make decisions about me or my students. Is a very different dynamic than I'm going to collect data directly from my students about how are you experiencing this thing? How is it feeling to you? Do you feel welcomed? Do you believe that I believe in you? Like those feedback back to teachers around that is really immediately actionable, and the students are the only ones who know the answers to those things, right? It doesn't matter what the teacher is trying to create in a classroom. It matters how that's landing with the particular set of young people in the room with them, or on Zoom with them, or out in the field with them. And so getting that feedback directly from those students. And I saw earlier in the chat, my beloved colleague, Nina Ryan, put in links to the PERTS Elevate tool and the consortium Cultivate tool. And these are two aligned tools that my team has been working with the folks at PERTS to develop. And one is a school level tool, and the other, Cultivate, is a school level kind of across the board, how are students experiencing their classrooms. And Elevate is a tool that teachers can use themselves to get feedback directly from their students over time. And it creates the kind of partnership between a teacher and their students, and like data back to the teacher that is just so valuable for their ability to create the kind of context that again, as Jen Meitchen says, like that, so that students can really take advantage of the high quality instruction that teachers are bringing. So I think it depends what kind of data, for what purpose, and who can respond to that.
Thank you. The what and the for what purpose. And I had not heard the terms downstream and upstream before, so I love that framing. And if there's anything that can go in the chat, that could be a resource for you more about that particular terminology. And before we look at the big takeaways, I want to remind you all to please look at the chat. Lots of good links in there. Someone just put in the link for our Castle 3 signature practices books, because a lot of people say, well, what's that? References to our SEL exchange in the fall. So be sure you look at the chat. Let's look at the big takeaways from our presenters. So if we could go to the takeaway slides. So I think one overarching theme that we all heard was that creating the conditions for students to engage in SEL requires school-wide and classroom learning environments that are supportive, culturally responsive, and focused on building relationships and community. Thank you. Another big takeaway: incentivizing districts to support school and classroom environments is an approach that requires guidance and criteria for funding to expand resources for districts who are creating those conditions. And we know so many of the districts on the call today are doing that. Another takeaway: taking a collaborative inquiry, yes, what's up, approach to developing supportive school and classroom climate begins with an initial root cause analysis to unpack and understand the experience that students have in school to implement systemic SEL strategies, fostering a strong school climate. And again, part of that root cause analysis is really engaging the voice of young people, hearing directly from them what's happening. I would like to thank Dr. Farrington. I'd like to thank Michelle Jackson so much for your participation with us today.